In November 2001, Hideo Kojima and Konami released a stealth action game called Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, the sequel to one of the best games of all time, Metal Gear Solid. In Metal Gear Solid, you play as Solid Snake, a legendary hero where you, throughout the game, find out why Snake is such a badass. That game was so good and that character was so great that when the sequel was announced, expectations were sky high. You can imagine then that when the main character of that game was revealed to not be Solid Snake, but an entirely new character, the gaming populace was justifiably angry, especially since the marketing leading up to that game led everyone to believe that Solid Snake would be the main character. I mean, the game is called Metal Gear Solid. Change of protagonists and angry gamers aside, Metal Gear Solid 2 turned out to also be one of the greatest games of all time. So, of course, 20 years later, Naughty Dog Vice President Neil Druckmann decided he and his development team were as good as Hideo Kojima and that he'd completely steal that concept and no one would notice. What's up, everyone? Welcome to Let's Talk, the series where I bring up 20-year-old games and tell you how it relates to current ones. This is your friendly neighborhood Birdman, and today I'm going to give you an honest review of the game that I just got done playing, The Last of Us Part 2. Full of spoilers, of course. Okay, now, since this is a game, I have to break this review down into sections, and I'm going to tell you up front the things that matter to me in a video game in order to thoroughly review it. These things are graphics, gameplay and controls, level design, plot structure, and of course, the story. In order to calculate my final score, each of these 5 sections will receive a score on a 0 to 20 scale, meaning the maximum this game can score in each category is a 20 with an overall maximum total of 100. So, first up, the graphics. Now, the first thing I've always noticed about Naughty Dog games is that people praise the graphics constantly. And for good reason. The Uncharted games and the first Last of Us were visually arresting. Hell, Uncharted 4 is still one of the best looking games of this generation. And yet, here is where I run into my first problem with this game. I'm not wowed by these graphics. This was actually one of the first things I talked about in my playthrough.
Graphics are alright. They're not like God of War. God of War blew me away, but these are okay. Not bad.
Up close though, the animations and character models do look pretty good, and the cutscenes are absolutely killer. The fidelity in the cutscenes were so good, in fact, that the transitions between cutscene and gameplay for me were mildly jarring, and it kind of annoys me when games do the whole cutscene to game transition, because if your gameplay doesn't look as good as the cutscene did, as is the case here, it only serves to further demonstrate the flaws of your graphics. In fact, this game can get ugly at times, with sometimes muddy textures on foliage and NPC character models in the distance. This is then compounded by the baffling decision to make this game 30 frames per second. Now, I don't know what it is about console players and their absolute lemming-like willingness to accept AAA games at 30 frames per second, but it is high time 30 FPS died a long overdue death. I mean, Naughty Dog themselves remastered the first Last of Us with 60 frames per second, and it looked sublime. Remember the game I mentioned from the intro? Yeah, that's a 19-year-old game, and it was pulling 60 frames per second on the PS2. Now, I know what you're going to say, but Birdman, this game has a higher resolution and better fidelity than that game. Well, what about another game Naughty Dog developed, Uncharted Lost Legacy? That game runs at 4K and in 60 frames per second in the multiplayer. You cannot tell me that Naughty Dog couldn't have made this game 60 frames or even 4K because they've already done it. In video games, frame rate is the most important part of graphics because it has a direct impact on gameplay. This is why titles like Resident Evil 2 Remake are best enjoyed on a PC, because the higher frame rate literally makes the knife the most powerful weapon in that game.
No choice. Gotta take it down.
And while that may not have been the intention, it only serves to prove the point that a higher frame rate equals better and smoother gameplay. If I were to offer a solution, it would be to allow the player to switch between performance and resolution. Therefore, in the category of graphics, I have to give this game 15 points. It's not a 0 because of the beautiful cutscenes and the fidelity of things that are close to the camera, but it's not a 20 because things in the distance can be pretty ugly, and this is a AAA title in 2020 that uses 30 frames per second. There is no excuse.
You're on fire! Oh shit, so am I!
The Last of Us 2 is by and large a stealth game, meaning the game gives you the tools to essentially sneak around and dispatch most enemies you come across in the game. And although the mechanics of stealth work fine for the most part, I personally struggled with the controls of this game. The funny thing is, with the exception of the prone mechanic, the controls are basically the exact same as the original Last of Us. And therein lies the problem. The original Last of Us came out in 2013 on the PS3. In that 7 years, games have come a very long way with regard to control schemes. I'm not going to make the claim that all video games have a unified control scheme, but most games share similar control layouts. For example, Modern Warfare, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Metro Exodus all use square to reload weapons. This is because when a game's main combat mechanic is shooting, it makes sense to use a layout the player will be comfortable and familiar with. This is why all of these games, including The Last of Us 2, use L2 to aim and R2 to fire. It just makes sense. Except The Last of Us 2 also uses R2 to reload, and pressing square causes your character to melee. I cannot tell you the amount of times I instinctively pressed square while trying to reload, but ended up meleeing thin air and getting my ass killed for accidentally popping out of cover. This is what happens when 99% of video games with similar combat use a similar layout, but you play the game in the 1% with a funky ass control scheme. Muscle memory takes over and you have to actively fight against your intuition, and it makes playing that game extremely, needlessly frustrating. Naughty Dog has implemented an impressive array of accessibility options up to the ability to remap the buttons on the controller. As much complaining as I was doing in my stream of this game about the controls, and there was a lot.
Except I don't know how to fucking reload. It's L2 to fucking reload. I can't see how that makes any sense. So many games.
And he's still standing.
Use square to reload. All right, I'm trying to get used to these fucking controls here. It's so garbage, the controls in this game. They're just like anti every other game. Like you hold L1 to run. It's ridiculous.
My audience began pleading with me to try remapping the controls. Here's the problem. Multiple actions are bound to the buttons. Remember when I said pressing R2 is simultaneously reload and fire? Yeah, that means if I wanted to remap the reload button to square, this also remaps fire to square and then unbounds the shoulder swap. Even attempting to remap the controls presents a host of unwanted outcomes, so I struggled on with the default control scheme, and I hated it the entire time. Moreover, doing pretty much anything that involved combat was clunky, slow, and completely out of place for an action game. Whenever all hell broke loose, the game became an exercise in frustration because of a combination of slow and clunky controls, a frustratingly complex user interface, absurdly accurate enemies, and a ridiculously low amount of ammunition. This game wants to be a shooter while making the shooter aspects needlessly complicated and difficult. It's infinitely smarter to attempt to stealth your way through the game, but this makes the game tedious and all the more frustrating when you're seen by an enemy you didn't even know was there. The crazy part about all this is when I was able to successfully wrangle the controls, the combat was extremely satisfying. This is actually the best thing about the game. Blowing a zombie's head off with a shotgun, dismembering the human enemies with a powerful pistol, and beating the shit out of people with your bare hands is pure gaming bliss.
Come on. Oh, she doesn't have a head. That shit is like 2019. Gone.
Specifically, playing with Abby is especially fun because not only does she attain the best weapons in the game, she has an extremely bruising fighting style that makes you feel like a grade A badass. I would purposefully break stealth with Abby simply because I wanted to fight things with her. It was that good.
What's up, fool? Bam!
Light him up.
Get ready.
Oh my goodness. Ooh. And let that be a lesson to you, kiddos. Work out.
The enemy types are lacking though, as the game only adds 2 types of infected, and one of them is a boss only encountered in one section of the game. I felt that the zombies as a whole took a back seat, and this was one of the glaringly obvious symptoms of that. The new Shambler enemy type doesn't really add much to the gameplay variety from the first game besides giving the player a new bullet sponge enemy to deal with. The human enemies are a bright spot in the game, however, as their AI is very impressive. The human enemies are actually pretty smart, and they outflanked me multiple times. The same cannot be said for your various AI partners throughout the game, as they are borderline useless the majority of the time. Personally, I'd prefer if game developers are going to give me a useless AI partner, they just eschew that partner altogether and allow me to go it alone. One last thing I'd like to bring up about the gameplay. It's extremely repetitive. First of all, there is zero gameplay innovation from the previous game aside from the new prone mechanic. That's right, this game has precisely the same mechanics, combat design, and overall feel of a 7-year-old game. The gameplay feels dated in a way that's difficult to put into words.
But I think that's the problem with padding out your runtime on a video game like this, is that it has to be repetitive. It's like Naughty Dog wrote a story and then they tried to build a game around that story, and what they did was just copy paste. We need a section here. Copy paste. It's the same thing with the doors. Oh, this door's locked. Find a way around. Copy paste. See, this is what I'm talking about. It's the same mechanic over and over. You have to hold triangle to open this door while being shot at by a billion people. Copy paste. Same thing over and over.
Basically what I'm saying is, if you played the original Last of Us, you've essentially played this game. Just like the original, when you see chest-high walls, you know you're in a section where you'll be fighting or sneaking around. That wouldn't be such a bad thing if you weren't doing exactly that same thing for 20 hours. The game is fundamentally walk slowly through an open area, loot cabinets in an abandoned building, get ambushed by infected, get out of the infested building, run into a group of survivors, stealth kill them, repeat. For 20 hours. So I know that was a lot, but gameplay is a pretty important aspect because that's what a game is, gameplay. Without it, you're watching a movie. With that said, this game overall is a bit of a chore to play, even though it has some really fun combat mechanics and animations. As I had problems with the controls which hampered how much fun I had with the gameplay, I have to give this category 10 points. The bad controls were a constant theme in my playthrough, and the fact that this game added almost nothing new gameplay-wise from the previous game, I can't honestly rate it higher than that.
I got you! Fuck!
A very large portion of this game involves walking from one area to another while looting cabinets and drawers in abandoned buildings for supplies. In my experience, looting games garner 2 opinions: people who love exploring every nook and cranny, and people who make a beeline to the next objective. I happen to be squarely in the latter. Personally, I play narrative games like this to experience the story, and long stretches of exploration or open world gameplay tend to bore me to tears. This is really one of those things where your mileage may vary, but this is a 20-hour game, and the vast majority of it, you're just walking to an arena where a fight will take place, or trying to figure out how to enter a building where the front door was locked. I am not joking when I say this game copy-pastes this idea for the entire game. However, this is a Naughty Dog game though, and there are a few thrilling set pieces. The areas where the infected have infested the place are kind of fun to run through, but as I mentioned earlier, the zombies have taken a back seat in this game, and there aren't enough of these areas for my liking. I got invested in the lore of the original Last of Us because the concept of cordyceps infecting humans the way they do insects in real life was an extremely original idea. So when this game made it more about the various human factions and their interactions, I became less invested in the areas and they all started to blend together. Like I said, this is a very subjective thing, but I found the way the levels were designed to be repetitive and boring, frankly. Considering this game is 20 hours long and you're doing the same exact things throughout these levels, I'm going to be generous and give level design 10 points out of 20. The areas are not exactly poorly designed, but they're boring as hell to go through, and it isn't until the very end of the game where you reach Santa Barbara that there is any interesting visual variation.
How long do we have to go to play with Ellie again? Because fuck, man. Like another, dude, an hour? We've already been playing as Abby for 10 hours. Fucking hell.
Alright, I'm going to come out and say it. This is probably the worst thing about this game. The game is told through two characters' perspectives, Ellie and Abby. Ellie's campaign is basically a revenge tale, as Abby near the beginning of the game brutally murders Joel, and Ellie sets out for Seattle to get revenge. Abby's campaign is told through a series of flashbacks and has nearly nothing to do with Ellie's revenge plot, although they intersect occasionally. That by itself causes a disconnect for the player. The game sets itself up as a revenge tale, but for nearly 50% of the game, you're playing a campaign that has little or nothing to do with that plot. The fact that the game forces you to play as the person who killed the previous game's protagonist for 11 hours is already annoying, but for that large section of the game to be flashbacks that don't move the story forward is to add insult to injury. There are literally flashbacks within flashbacks, and this only serves to disjoint an already disjointed narrative.
4 months earlier, another flashback. Thank you, Naughty Dog, because what I want to do is go back and not continue the game.
Personally, I didn't at all care about anyone in Abby's campaign, as they were all pieces of shit, and I wanted to play as Ellie getting her revenge on these people, but the game kept flashing back, trying to get me to care about these characters. It was extremely frustrating that the main plot of the story paused about 9 hours in and didn't pick back up for another 11 hours.
Like, I do appreciate Abby. I like, what I like about her is just her brutal fighting style, because I like the combat in this game, but I'm over it at this point. It's like this game is padding itself. It's padding the runtime, okay? This game should not be this fucking long. It should not be this long. We are still playing as Abby, and I don't understand it. This person killed the main protagonist, and it seems like they're trying their damnedest to make me like this character. And I hate this character. I want to kill her. That was the last thing that we saw, Abby pointing the gun at Ellie, and that was hours ago, dude. That's like 4 or 5 hours ago. I feel like I've played as Abby more or longer than I've played with Ellie, who was supposed to be the main character. But I guess this game is saying that Abby is one of the main characters, is the main character.
When you finally regain control of Ellie, it's for a small section at a farm that you aren't even sure is real or not, until the game then switches back to Abby. Although this was an extremely small section, this was my genuine reaction to having switched back to Abby.
XYZ, no way. I'm not, dude, are we playing as Abby again?
Okay, Constance. Now we just need... Oh, we checked this street a week ago. I can't believe you traded a pistol for this.
This is not the reaction you want when people play your game. A 5.
Then enter the biggest bait and switch in video game history. 2 years after that incident, you now play as a character named Raiden. And you're like, who is this guy? This is gonna be for a few minutes, right? I'm gonna play as him for a little bit and then go back to Snake. Nope, you play as Raiden for the entire game. Now, playing as a new character that's not Solid Snake wouldn't be so bad if they just promoted it like that. They didn't let you know that there were bigger things going on. They didn't let you know that you were going to play as a different character. So naturally, people were pissed. They were like, I played through Metal Gear Solid 5,000 times. Now you're telling me I have to be this other guy who's not half as cool as Snake?
Now, here's the section I'm sure you've all been waiting for. What did I think of the story? Remember at the beginning of this video where I mentioned Metal Gear Solid 2? Yeah, that's what this game wanted to be, but it failed where Sons of Liberty succeeded. Naughty Dog, just like Hideo Kojima, attempted to hide the fact that you would be playing the majority of the game as an entirely different character than what you expected. The twist here is that Raiden didn't kill the main protagonist from the original game, so you don't actually hate the character past the initial what the fuck moment, and you get over it fairly quickly. You feel the complete opposite in this game. Seriously, my disdain for Abby the character was so pronounced, even at the 16-hour mark. This is exactly what I did when Abby and Ellie faced off.
No, get up. Get up. Get in the open. Yeah. There you go. There you go. Do it again. Light her the fuck up. Shoot her ass. And that's the end of the stream, guys. The Last of Us, it's over. That's the end. We win.
But I digress. As I mentioned earlier, the narrative is split between two characters, and for the most part, I enjoyed the heck out of Ellie's story. I was entirely engrossed in what her motivations were, and I felt her pain and struggles as she grappled with the deaths of her friends and her father figure. Naughty Dog sure knows how to open a video game and set up a premise. So believe me when I say, Up until 9 hours in the game, I was having a relatively good time enjoying the story. When the game halted its momentum and decided to switch to Abby's perspective in the past, I was initially disappointed, but I grew to like Abby as a character over time. Let me be clear, I hated Abby within the story itself and wanted nothing more than to get revenge on her as Ellie, but as a narrative element, I really liked Abby. Hell, as a gameplay mechanic, I loved Abby. Her section of the game was more fun because she had better weapons than Ellie, and she's such a beast in hand-to-hand combat. I had the biggest grins on my face during Abby's playthrough.
Abby's a monster, dude.
But when I came to the realization that Abby's section was nothing more than an attempt to get me to empathize with Abby and her actions due to Joel killing her father, it was then that I fell out of love with Abby as a narrative element.
Like, I can understand where Abby's coming from.
Hang out with the seals.
Her father was killed. She wants revenge. I get it. It's just at the expense of characters that we cared about. You know what I mean? I think that's my complaint.
You have to understand, after playing this game to completion, I couldn't help but feel as if Naughty Dog watched Avengers Infinity War and went, yep, that's what our game's going to be. Of course, that's not what they did, but you can't help but compare Abby to Thanos. Just like Infinity War was Thanos' movie, The Last of Us 2 is Abby's game. Both are clearly villains, and both of their respective stories are attempts at rationalizing their actions. The problem here is that in Thanos' case, the creators of the story want to see Thanos fail, and for the heroes to eventually win. With Abby, it's almost as if Naughty Dog prefers her to the original protagonists. Think about it. Abby's and Ellie's story parallel each other in significant ways. Both of their fathers were killed for reasons they don't initially understand, and both set out on an adventure seeking retribution for their father's killer. Except Abby is afforded her revenge when she finally kills Joel, and when it comes time for Ellie to kill Abby, she inexplicably lets her go. Ellie initially gives up her revenge because she realized she had a family, and then for a second time she decides to go after Abby, losing her entire family in the process, and she still allows Abby to live. Listen, there is nothing more frustrating as a gamer than getting blue-balled with regard to the story. I suffered through repetitive gameplay, frustrating controls, playing as a character I didn't want to play with for 10 plus hours just to not even get the satisfaction of getting revenge on Abby. I get what Naughty Dog attempted to accomplish. Through forcing you to play as the antagonist for an extended period of time, they want you, as a player, to also forgive Abby, to understand that revenge begets a cycle of death. The problem is they do an extremely poor job of eliciting that feeling and building upon that concept for the player. Ellie has a moment of clarity at the very end of the game, and at that same time, the player is shown a flashback of a conversation between Ellie and Joel, where Ellie learns the power of forgiveness. The problem is that this flashback obviously happens way before Ellie goes on a revenge tour of Seattle, murdering numerous people on the way to finding Abby. This means the flashback at the end of the game is a cheap way of sparing the villain and offers the player an overwhelmingly unsatisfactory conclusion.
What? No. No. That's not happening. She's letting her go?
If Naughty Dog had simply offered the player a choice whether to spare or kill Abby in the end, it would have actually given that flashback the weight they assumed it had. Robbing the player of any agency in that moment has got to be one of the cheapest Deus Ex Machinas I've ever seen, and I watched War of the Worlds. I cannot impress upon you the overwhelming sense of having wasted my time playing this game. I was willing to put up with all the things I complained about because I knew at the end Ellie would put Abby in the dirt. I'm sorry, the ending of this game ruins it. I'm willing to give this game credit for initially hooking me with its premise, and there are moments in the story where I was completely engrossed, but in the end, I can only give this game a generous 10 points out of 20 because as a player, it wasted my time and took away any choice I could have made. Forcing me to slog through hours of gameplay only to rip the rug from under me has really soured me on this franchise, and I have to say, I'm no longer interested in The Last of Us. I'm done. So those are my thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2. The game receives a 50 out of 100 from me, and that makes it an average game. If the story were better, it would at least be an above average game because I thoroughly enjoyed the brutal combat and most of Ellie's story. But that ending, coupled with the repetitive gameplay and ridiculous plot structure, bring this game down for me. But that's just what I think. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Let's Talk. This has been your friendly neighborhood Birdman, and I'll catch you in the next one.